Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I wanted to do a brief overview and talk a little bit about the big number three, if there were a sort of holy trinity of the most iconic pulp heroes from the pulp magazine era. Of course, you have the Shadow as the first and foremost, and really the originator of the hero pulp industry that sprang up after the success of the Shadow magazine. The second would be Doc Savage, but the third would be the Spider, the master of men himself, otherwise known as Richard Wentworth. The Spider is certainly the pulpiest of all the pulp heroes, and while he was very much designed by popular publications to be very much, shall we say, inspired by the Shadow, the Spider very quickly diverged from that and became the most sensational of all the pulp heroes, and is famous for just how bloody and crazy the stories can get. Once Norvell Page, who was the primary writer of the 118 Spider pulp novels, took over and really built the character and added to the incredible supporting cast. And the Spider character and stories have been so hugely influential and were drawn upon directly, shall we say, by comics so deeply that a lot of the core themes of the Spider and ideas and concepts and some of the various villains and rogues gallery and also the supporting characters are going to be very much familiar to you when you first read a Spider story. The Spider has also been anthologized and redone by a lot of modern comic companies, so there are a lot of modern Spider tales and Spider comics or team-ups with the Spider and other, usually the classic pulp characters. So the Spider is definitely among the more well-known and more famous of the pulp characters, which is why I think it's easy to see him as the third of the sort of holy trinity with Doc Savage and the Shadow. Now, to talk a little bit about the Spider as a character and the world of the Master of Men, and to give you a little idea about the stories themselves, again, the character was created by popular publications and lasted for 118 issues. So there are 118 Spider novels. Now, it started under the author R.T.M. Scott, and everyone wrote on the Spider under the sort of house name of Grant Stockbridge, which was commonly done for all the pulp characters. Famously, Walter Gibson wrote the majority of the Shadow novels under the house name of Maxwell Grant, and this pretty much was the same sort of practice done for all the pulp characters. But R.T.M. Scott writes the first two Spider novels, which are more sort of traditional mystery in their style, and they are a bit slower paced, and it was deemed as not really what the publisher was wanting, because they really wanted to capture a section of the newsstand and compete with the amazing success of the Shadow magazine. That was the inspiration for creating this character in the first place, to have their own sort of competing version of the Shadow. So it was in selecting Norvell Page to write the Spider that really signals the birth of the Spider as we know him, and the style and tone of the novels and the supporting cast and everything. So if you look at the Spider novels in chronological order, do keep in mind the first two Scott novels are not exactly fully formed. You might consider them sort of work in progress versions or things like that, but the Spider really becomes the Spider when Norvell Page takes over, and it would be Page who would write the majority of the 118 novels, and it's really his that are the Spider that we know and think of. So who is the Spider? Who is this mysterious scourge of criminals everywhere? Well, the Spider is one Richard Wentworth, who is a man of a certain amount of wealth who has devoted his life to crime fighting under the secret identity of the Spider. And this would develop a bit over time, but it started with what we see in a lot of the illustrations and covers of the classic domino mask, hat, cape, and wielding the dual 45s, which of course is very much taken from the Shadow directly. But very quickly it develops in the stories, and what Page would do is have the Wentworth character start disguising himself more and eventually build up the Spider into a terrifying sight that we don't often see on the covers. So Wentworth would disguise himself as a very hideous and terrifying figure, usually with a sort of deformed face via makeup, and he'd also apply fangs, and he'd also create a hunchback. So you had this fanged, hunchback demon figure of the night that would appear and lay waste to criminals everywhere, because the Spider did not have a no kill rule. The Spider has just about the highest body count of any classic pulp character you'll ever see, and that's just looking at the criminals he dispatches in various ways, and not even getting into the overall body count of the stories themselves, which are astronomical. But the Spider would, of course, also leave his mark, and this was something else that would develop over time, but eventually it became the Spider's mark that Wentworth would have in a special ring that he would leave the red mark of the Spider essentially imprinted on the foreheads of all of his dead victims. So that way the police and everyone knew it was the work of the Spider, the master of men. And that sort of moniker, it comes from the Spider's ability to sort of command attention with his voice and appearance alone to a room full of terrified criminals. And of course the Spider would, because he's this horrifying, demonic looking figure complete with fangs and dual wielding 45s, laying waste to everyone who gets in his way who is a criminal. So of course he would be the master of men in that sense. Of course, you can't have a great hero character without a phenomenal supporting cast. So of the supporting cast of the Spider, the main names that you will see time and time again, who are just as fantastically well thought out as the Spider himself, we have the police commissioner Stanley Kirkpatrick, who is the sort of best friend of Wentworth, but also believes him to be the Spider, but can never quite prove it, and still continually tries to do so. But the Spider and Commissioner have a sort of uneasy alliance that kind of goes back and forth throughout all the novels. So that is the Spider's sort of official / unofficial enemy / frenemy in the police department. And of course, this would be reflected time and time again in comic vigilantes, but never as vividly drawn as seen here, where the police commissioner is constantly trying to prove that his best friend is indeed the Spider. We have the sort of team of the Spider include Sergeant Jackson, who is acting as Wentworth's chauffeur, but is a trusted member of the Spider's team of associates. But we also have Wentworth's manservant, as it is seen in the public persona, and that is the character of Ram Singh, who is a Sikh character and is also the Spider's right hand and is serving the Spider's crusade, because Wentworth in the past wound up saving the life of Ram Singh and his father. And so what started as a sort of life debt of sorts became a lifelong friendship, and Singh decided to join Wentworth on his honorable crusade in all of its forms, and follows the Spider to hell and back in every story, and is a remarkably phenomenal character, able to be unbelievably charming and menacing in the same breath, and an expert in all forms of combat and weaponry. And very nicely for a character of ethnic origin at this time in a pulp story, Ram Singh is very much his own man, a very intelligent, well-drawn character who is never depicted as being a demeaning stereotype, and would certainly be upset at anyone who tried to label him as such. He actually follows the Spider of his own accord. So in that sense, it's very much the sort of dynamic of the character of Cato in the Green Hornet, who is in daily life supposedly the chauffeur and manservant, but in actuality is the right hand of the Green Hornet, and they are equal partners in a team. So that sort of dynamic, I think, is first seen here with Ram Singh and the Spider. But as great as the Ram Singh character is, I think the greatest asset of the Spider stories is in the heroine character of Nita Van Sloan, who is, for myself and I think a lot of other people, probably the greatest female character in the pulp stories, and one of the greatest female characters in all of fiction, because not only is she Richard Wentworth's longtime fiancée, and they never actually get married because Wentworth can't risk her life and safety due to his never-ending crusade against crime. Tell me if that sounds familiar for comic heroes and vigilantes. But Nita Van Sloan is not one to rest on her laurels. Yes, she gets captured a lot. Yes, she is sometimes put in danger, but she is never a damsel in distress. She frequently gets involved in the action. Sometimes she will even disguise herself as the Spider to draw attention away from Wentworth. She will kill people. She does go through mortal peril, but she is a fully liberated female character, which is beyond striking for this point in time, especially in pulp magazines, which for the pulp hero characters frequently would, usually at the publisher's insistence, downplay the female characters or the side characters because these stories were supposed to be about action first and foremost, and that's something even the readership seemed to intonate, which is why you don't see a lot of really strong, consistent female characters in most of the pulp stories outside of certain side characters or members of the regular sort of cast of characters. But Nita Van Sloan in The Spider is the most important of the supporting cast and the most striking and endearing and atypical of the time. So for me, the secret weapon of the Spider is actually the Nita Van Sloan character being a complete and total badass in every story. And then we come to the stories themselves, which are famous among pulp fans for being so completely over the top in intensity levels and villain plots and schemes that while this does start a little bit smaller in the earlier stories, it's already a major factor and what sets the Spider apart. Because in practically every Spider story that Norvell Page wrote, the Spider isn't just going up against a villain or a gang or a conspiracy or something. No, it's always got to be something that's earth-shattering. The whole city is at stake, or it's a plague or an epidemic or some seeming act of nature that's actually a villain plot. And this always involves countless, untold numbers of deaths. The death tolls in a Spider novel will quickly hit the dozens, the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands, sometimes even in the millions if it's a crisis that threatens the whole country or the entire world, as seen in some Spider stories. So it is always a life and death struggle, and usually the Spider winds up himself getting blamed for certain things. So in a lot of Spider novels, it will be the Spider trying to evade not just the police, but everyone who thinks that who the Spider is somehow responsible for whatever the calamity is at the time. So the Spider was never a series about just a simple crime fighter. No, every Spider story is about major threats. The first couple Spider stories I ever read, I knew this was a factor, but I didn't realize just how much of a factor it was. And I was quickly assured of this when I started thinking about the body counts. And by a couple chapters in, I realized we were, getting between 50 and 100,000 dead. Like, we're not even halfway through the book. How much? And of course, that went into astronomical territory due to the actual threat of a plague of mutated, deadly vampire bats. And even though that might sound a bit silly, the intensity factor of the action and the Spider's struggle, which he barely survives every single novel, is such that these novels are... You can't put them down. Once you start them, you can't stop because the intensity is such that you really don't have time to question some of the sheer over-the-topness of the continual set pieces and events in the plot of the novel, because once you start a Spider adventure, you can't stop. You're so hooked into it that you have to know how that chapter ends, and then you're immediately in the next chapter, and then suddenly, but before you know it, the novel is over, and you have to take a bit of a breather because the pacing is just... The foot never goes off the gas pedal, and Richard Wentworth as the Spider barely survives throughout almost every novel and somehow will manage to hopefully overcome the terrible plot of the villain of that particular novel. Now, some novels would stretch out into story arcs, so there are some spider stories that stretched out over a couple novels, and there are some occasions where the villain didn't get killed by the spider and actually escaped or came back later. But those were very few and far between because the spider did not like to leave anyone alive, pretty much, because he just kills everyone. But never in the sort of undeserving way. He didn't just kill without compunction. It was always the villains tried to kill him, or once the villains were uncovered, they would face the wrath of the spider, which of course was death. So there was no other way it was going to end for them. But the spider was always exacting justice in his own particular unsanctioned way, shall we say? So where, say for example, the shadow might have spared someone's life if he felt it necessary or called for it. He didn't display a sort of bloodlust, whereas the spider pretty much runs on that. So there's certainly a degree of the reader first experiencing a spider novel and going, holy crap, he just kills everybody, doesn't he? So I do think the spider is obviously one of the most important pulp characters and one of the easiest to get into and just get sucked into the world of the spider. It has become such an iconic series in terms of all the things it influenced. So just like The Shadow and Doc Savage, the spider has influenced so much and been ripped off so many times that actually reading a spider novel is in some ways seeing a lot of these tropes we know from comics and other areas, seeing them for the first time or seeing them fleshed out more, realizing where some of these character archetypes come from. And also it's fascinating to see how the spider is very much not derivative, but was very much created to be a shadow for a different publisher, but also very quickly distinguished himself. And if you prefer your pulp stories with full pulp, if to compare pulp novels to orange juice, if you like super pulpy pulp novels, then the spider is your hero of choice, because there is no pulpier pulp hero than the adventures of the Master of Men. The Norvell Page spider stories are full intensity, over the top, all the way through. And while the earlier books do have some degree of building that world and don't get quite as intensive and crazy in their scope and scale as later books will, they are setting the stage for that, and they are building the character's world, and those elements are already there. So you will be able to recognize how the character grows over time and how there are different sort of eras of the character, as there are with The Shadow and Doc Savage. But every Norvell Page spider story is gleefully intensive, and there's nothing else, I think, in all of literature quite like reading a spider novel. This would probably explain why the spider's probably the most reprinted of the characters, and it can be very daunting and kind of confusing as a new reader of the spider, trying to figure out which editions to go for, because there are different types, different publishers, and also certain more famous stories get reprinted more, but it's very difficult to try to get all of the novels because you have to sort of jump between different publishers. So I wanted to do a brief rundown of the different editions that are out there in case you were curious about reading a spider story, to give you an idea of what's available. So the spider, like The Shadow and Doc Savage and other characters, did see a number of paperback reprints in the 70s and 80s, usually without the pulp illustrations and done like an adventure novel of the time. Those are really nice and collectible, but in the more modern realm of actual pulp replicas, of trying to get the original dual column format and the original illustrations as well, you have a number of different choices. So the longest running for a while were the reprints done by Girasol, who did both complete replicas of the original magazines, but then they also did the more traditional double pulp reprints that we know from the sort of style that Sanctum Books would do with their Shadow, and also they did a few spider issues as well. So the Girasol line did do a number of the spider novels in both pulp magazine replica form and double novel reprints, but they did not get to finish the whole series, so if you collected those, you wouldn't have every spider novel. Then you have the reprints done by Pulp Adventure and later Bold Venture Press, which I have one of them here. This is done as a single novel with a reproduction of the original gorgeously striking cover artwork here for The Citadel of Hell. I mean, doesn't that just make you want to read this with this cover and that title? And this is a fantastic story, of course, with an entire country under siege due to a nefarious food shortage that is blamed on the spider, so the stakes can't be higher. And this is an earlier spider novel, too, so even one of the earlier spider novels has intensity factor that high, so I wasn't kidding about even the early spiders have that. But anyway, this is done in a nice style. We have a nice matching spine on all of these, and then the rear has nice imagery as well. Eventually, they did wind up doing a good number of the spider stories in this format and style with nice images. Each of these would feature a complete spider novel with the recreation of the original pulp layout with the dual columns and the original illustrations. They would also usually include a little bit of note about upcoming issues and things, but it was really just reprinting a single spider novel. Here's a lovely dual page spread of fantastic art as well. But also they would sometimes include other stories that were featured in the spider magazine, such as we have here. So you get an extra bonus story that was in a spider magazine but is not a spider story. So these are really nice reprints, and Bold Venture did do a number of these, but it's hard to figure out how many they did because there's not really an official website listing for these outside of random volumes on Bold Venture's site or on various comic resellers sites or volumes you find on eBay. So I don't think they obviously did all 118. So if you were collecting these, you would just be getting the nice pulp reprint version in the dual column format with the artwork for certain volumes in the Bold Venture run. The first Spider edition I ever read, and probably the easiest to recommend, would be one of the 2 volumes from Baen Books, which did 2 volumes. This is the one I have, entitled Robot Titans of Gotham. Each of these was done in a lovely trade paperback edition like this. Both feature wonderful new Steranko artwork of the spider, especially done for these, so they have nice collectible covers. Each of these has 2 really fantastic spider stories, some of the classic, most famous ones. This one has Satan's Murder Machines, where a essentially force of seemingly unstoppable giant robots, secretly controlled by criminals, lay waste to all of New York City, and only the spider can stop them. And then the second is the novel I alluded to earlier, the first spider novel I ever read, Death Reign of the Vampire King, where a villain known as the Batman, yep, that's the villain's name, has essentially mutated or grown a special breed of vampire bat who are extremely fatal to humans and unleashes a plague of these vampire bats across the world, and only the spider can stop him. So these are 2 of the most famous spider stories, a great starting off point with the character, and this nice affordable volume. They also include another story from the same publisher of The Octopus, which is a very bizarre story inclusion in this volume. Very grisly and dark, not really associated with the spider, but a fascinating pulp story that I had heard of but just never gotten to read. So that's a nice inclusion to make this volume even nicer. The only issue with this and certain pulp reprints is that they're not trying to recreate the original style. So it's a little easier on the eye to just have traditional pages, but they're not recreating or replicating the original artwork. So you do lose out on that, unfortunately, and that is a bit of a negative because the original pulp art is so distinctive that once you know about it, you do miss it not being here. But still, this is the most affordable and easiest starting point for anybody with the spider. This was the first spider experience I ever had, so I would recommend people check out one of the Baen collections, or in particular this one, which can be had for well under $20. And sometimes you can find, I know one of the Bayham books also has a hardcover version if you prefer hardcovers, but this is the easiest jumping off point with the Spider, and the particular copy I would recommend of a reprint to try if you've never read a Spider novel. There's also another lovely reprint entitled The Spider versus the Empire State that collects an entire famous multi-novel story arc of the Spider, and that's available on Amazon, so that's probably the best new published version of a Spider reprint in a nice handsome edition that's also very affordable, which I can recommend. I just haven't looked at that particular printing yet. Also, Sanctum Books, who was behind the Incredible Shadow and Doc Savage reprints, and I think the probably the best of all the pulp reprints, did do a number of Spider novels that I've been picking up when I find them. Unfortunately, they only did 10 in their fantastic double novel style. So this is just like their Shadow, Doc Savage, Avenger, and other reprints, but nicely they gave the Spider a blood red spine because, of course, the Spider deserves a blood red section of your bookshelf, because these are the pulpiest and bloodiest pulp hero adventures you'll ever find. And then on the rear, as always, they included a copy of the original cover for each of the pulp novels within. We have a full replication of the original dual column style with all of the original artwork nicely restored as well. So again, Sanctum is really the benchmark for all pulp reprints in terms of quality and the typeface and the reproduction of artwork. But also they nicely would have scholarly articles. So you have a nice introduction, usually have a nice conclusion, but also, if I can get to it, a wonderful Will Murray essay with images in between the two novels, also making connections to comics and stories the Spider influenced, or the elements that were lifted from the Spider for later things, but also finding connections in between the two novels in the particular volume. So these historical scholarly pieces are worth their weight in gold, and part of why the Sanctum reprints are, I think, the best of pulp replicas. Unfortunately, Sanctum only got to do 10 or so volumes of Spider stories, so they, of course, didn't do all 118. So nicely, Steger Books now is doing a complete reprint series, and they have basically started doing all the Spiders in paperback form with a version of the original cover and at a nice price. I just haven't tried one of them yet. I don't know for sure if they have the internal illustrations or dual column style. I'm thinking they might not, because they do seem to be smaller paperbacks, but it's just great to see somebody going through and chronologically publishing all 118 novels. So they've done most of them so far. I think they're getting close to having all 118 published. And they're now also offering an omnibus edition of, instead of getting 118 individual paperbacks, you can actually buy a collected omnibus of, I think it's 4 per omnibus, like 4 or 5 Spider stories. So you can also get these omnibus editions they're doing as well. But that would be the best option for getting a complete set of all 118 novels when they finish, because they already have republished most of the whole run, and they are doing more and actually completing the series, as opposed to all the other publishers who never got to complete the whole run of all 118 Spider adventures. There are, of course, other Spider stories and comics and adaptations. There's a variety of different Spider experiences you can have. There are, of course, Dynamite comics of the Spider. Moonstone did a number of comics and graphic novels and books and short story collections, which are really great. There are, of course, some film adaptations, but really the only one that is truly great and of major importance is the fantastic Columbia serial that they produced in the heyday of cliffhanger serials. And that is a really fantastic serial that, while it does make some tweaks and changes, as serials would, and obviously you couldn't have the Spider being as bloodthirsty and pulp-tastic as he is in the novels in a studio film, let alone a serial of the time. It is an above-average Columbia serial of the time, so we do at least have a great cinematic experience and adaptation of the Master of Men in the form of the Spider serial, The Spider's Web. Columbia would also produce a really nice sequel serial, The Spider Returns, as well, so you have not one but 2 great serials. Ultimately, the Spider is a fascinating character. I am now becoming more and more enraptured and directly obsessed with the adventures. Once I started reading the Spider novels, that was just it. I was just hooked from the get-go. They are very different from The Shadow and Doc Savage, and are very much not necessarily an acquired taste, but they are for a completely different audience, shall we say. And if you like your pulp stories with full pulp in them, the Spider is the hero for you, and definitely deserves greater recognition, and was certainly a heavy influence, at least in the creation of Spider-Man in certain ways, because Stan Lee was an avowed pulp fan and did pull many pulp elements into Marvel Comics, as I've already discussed with Captain Fury popping up in various Marvel stories and characters in different ways. But even the sort of costume people have for the Spider, especially what you see in a lot of the comics and things, of the sort of web design and a mask used in the costume, is very much an influence on Spidey's costume. And, you even, of course, have the name, and it seems quite obvious that's what was floating around in Stan Lee's head, probably to at least to a great degree, when they were trying to name Spider-Man as a character. Of course, that's probably going to be the greatest line drawing together the Master of Men and the most famous Spider in fiction to the other most famous Spider in fiction, Spider-Man. The Spider is just a seemingly never-ending spring of imagination when you read the stories. They are phenomenal entertainment. They are great novels. There's nothing else quite like reading a Spider novel. Many people throughout the years have been great fans and supporters of the character, and it's nice to see that the Spider does at least have some recognition in the field of comics, and at least is known somewhat as a character, and a pulp inspiring character. That's the nice way of putting that. Most comics stole wholesale elements from the classic pulp characters, but at least there is some knowledge of the character. But it's very rare that people actually sit down and read a Spider novel, because if you do, you're going to get hooked pretty much immediately if you're reading one of the Norvell Page classic Spider novels, which I think everyone should. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about the wonders of the Spider, the incredible fun of reading the Spider pulps, but also to talk a little bit about the reprints and trying to figure out which ones to start with, or maybe getting into the Steger complete reprint series. So as always, I hope my babbles about classic pulp heroes and pulp magazines have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do check out The Adventures of the Spider if you haven't before. You will not be bored ever. It's impossible to be bored by a Spider story, and you will be hooked, and probably hooked for life, due to the sheer incredible pacing and intensity factor of all the Norvell Page Spider novels. So I strongly urge you to check out one of the reprints if you haven't. I will link to some of the versions in print below that I discussed, and you can choose to start with one of those if you wish. So as always, please do keep supporting both your local independent bookstores, comic stores, and independent publishers by purchasing reprints like this, because not only does that help keep them in business, it also helps to spread the cause of recognizing the pulp era as one of the great moments in American literature that needs to be properly respected, and was really the launching point for a lot of our pop culture that it's not given the credit for. And it was a great launching pad for most of the great American writers who did actually start in the pulp magazines in various ways and in different genres and things. And the pulp heroes of the pulp magazines are the most important, the most influential on, of course, comics at large, since comics were basically born out of the pulp heroes and the pulp magazines. So aside from Black Mask and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler really reinventing American detective fiction, it is the pulp heroes who remain the most important aspect and longest lasting legacy aspect of the pulp magazines, and should be recognized on those merits, and for being an incredibly important part of American culture, of the history and development of hero characters as well, but also of American literature. So as always, keep reading print books, keep enjoying pulp novels, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.